Hello and welcome to the Chapter 1 overview of Anatomy and Physiology of us. This is a bought book by myself. If you are willing to support us, make sure to check us out on the Discord. Support it by either Nitro gifting or support us through the group page. To begin, we have a bunch of learning objectives for this course. Define the terms of anatomy, physiology, pathophysiology, and homeostasis. Describe the systems of the body. Define the terms of anatomic position, frontal plane, transverse plane, sagittal plane, and mid-sagittal plane. Use proper terminology to describe the location of body parts with respect to one another. Understand the basics of chemistry and their contribution to the study of anatomy and physiology. To begin, anatomy is the study of the structure and makeup of the organism. It is a gross anatomy structure and can be continued down to a microscopic level. Physiology is the study of the process and functions of the body. Homeostasis is the state of a balance in which organs and systems can function effectively. Pathophysiology is the study of functioning of an organism in the presence of a disease. Systematic anatomy is where we study each organ system separately, which we will go through all of the different systems in ourself in a moment. Regional anatomy, which studies specific regions of the body, and the systemic approach is used in this book. So the overview of body systems, once again, we can trace it back to an anatomically small size and scale, reaching down from the atom, moving up, building its way up to a molecule, a macromolecule, and building all of the systems. We can work our way through the organelles, cells, building the tissues, and then making organ systems and the us, which are organisms. An overview of our systems, we have quite a few. Skeletal system, the muscular system, circulatory, lymphatic, immune, respiratory, nervous, gastrointestinal, urinary, reproductive, endocrine, and integumentary systems. The topographic anatomy is to identify superficial landmarks to make accurate assessments. Anatomical position is the universal position from which all body positions and movements are described. A universal position subject would be standing upright, facing the observer with arms straight and palms forward, as shown in the model. Directional terms always pertain to the patient's right or left. As you can see, posterior is rear, anterior meaning front, proximal meaning towards the head, distal meaning away. Superior is near the head, inferior is away from the head. Midline is the cut down the middle. You have the medial towards the center of that midline, and lateral is towards the outside of that midline. The planes of the body, we have the frontal, transverse, and the sagittal plane, as shown in the model. The frontal, or the coronal plane, divides the body into front and the back. That is the slide in blue. The transverse axial plane divides the body into top and bottom, which is the green plane. The sagittal or lateral plane divides the body into left and right, which is the purple plane. It's the blue. The mid-sagittal plane divides left and right equal halves, which would actually be, if you were to look at the person directly in front, as if you were examining them posterior or anterior, and you would find that they have 4 quadrants. The mid-sagittal plane would divide them in half. We have frontal, transverse, axial, sagittal, which is lateral, superior, meaning closer, inferior, meaning closer to the feet, medial, towards the midline, lateral, away from the midline, proximal, towards the trunk of the body, distal, away from the trunk, anterior is the front side of the body, or ventral, posterior is the back side of the body, or dorsal. The mid-clavicular line is a vertical line through the middle portion of the clavicle, also known as the collarbone, and parallel to the midline. The mid-axillary line is a vertical line drawn through the axilla to the waist. The anterior axillary line is a parallel line drawn just an inch or so in front of the mid-axillary line. Posterior axillary line is a parallel line drawn an inch or so behind the mid-axillary line. Here we have a diagram showing all of these lines. We have the medial, which would cut down here, the mid-clavicular, which would actually cut about an inch from the nipple, transverse, which hangs just above the floating ribs, and the mid-axillary, which would show, if I turn my head to the left, it would show right down the middle. We have abdominal quadrants that are actually very useful, especially when palpating the abdomen. We have two imaginary lines intersecting at the umbiculus. We have the right upper quadrant, left upper quadrant, and the right and left lower quadrants. Each of the quadrant, it is very important to memorize what they contain. If you feel a stiffness, firmness, or any kind of bubbling or pressure, it is good to know where it is stemming from. Specific organs are located in each of the four quadrants, once again, and pain or injury can be described as being in a quadrant. We have ROM, or ROM, range of motion, which is the full distance that a joint can be moved. Flexion is from the anatomic position moving it to a distal point of an extremity closer to the trunk. Flexion of the elbow brings the hand closer to the shoulder. Flexion of the knee brings the foot up to the buttocks, and flexion of the fingers forms the hand into a fist. Extension is motion associated with the return of a body part from a flexed position to an anatomic position. In the anatomic position, all extremities are in extension. In movement, possible neck positions when the patient is found in the supine position are neutral, flexion, and extension. Usually when you are sleeping, the majority of the time your head will be in a flexed position. Hyper is a prefix added to the terms of flexion or extension to indicate a mechanism of injury. Hyperflexion and hyperextension are both injuries that can be quite severe. Ankle injuries such as supination and pronation. So here we have some pictures, and they actually show what is caused. As you can see, the first photo, which actually shows the person's arm, the hands are anatomically correct. They are flexed, or no, they're not flexed. They're not flexed, they're extended. And with these fingers extended, you can actually determine as the bones can align correctly. Right here in the diagram, it actually shows like a fork and how the mechanism of injury is possibly correlated to the breakage. And you can use all of these different tools to help you guide your way into diagnosing with the correct medicines, with the correct treatment. Internal rotation describes turning an extremity medially towards the midline, and external rotation describes turning an extremity away from the midline. So that would be internal is like this, external would be like this. Rotation can also be applied to the spine. Spine is rotated when it's twists on its axis. Placing the chin on the shoulder rotates the cervical spine, like so. Abduction is moving an extremity away from the midline, and adduction is moving the extremity towards the midline. The recumbent position is when the patient is lying down or leaning back, as seen in the 3 examples. Supine is a body resting on its back with the face upwards. Prone is a body that is lying with the face and abdomen downwards. Fowler's position is a patient who is sitting up. In most cases, you will see people in the Fowler's position if they have come in contact with intoxication, are woozy, or if they have a diabetic issue and they're not feeling 100%. Semi-Fowler's is a patient who is sitting up but leaning back with the upper body slightly leaning back. You can also see this chance when somebody is going hypoglycemic. When somebody is hypoglycemic, it means that they have low blood sugar. This also means that they have the inability to have enough energy to keep standing up. They don't have enough energy to do much of other things. Leaning them back provides them a nice comfortable position while allowing you as a responder to introduce them to any medications needed. The Trendelenburg's position is a modification of the supine position for patients with symptoms of hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion is the basically it just means extensive sweating. The patient has lower extremities elevated approximately 1 foot to help the blood flow to the torso and the brain. This is also called or known as the recovery position, or not. It is called the recovery position for stroke victims, however. Then we have the actual recovery position, which is used for patients who have not sustained trauma to the neck or back, and this is used to help drain fluid from the mouth. We use this position if you were to find someone unconscious, where you would always place them in the recovery position first to identify at least that they have not sustained any noticeable head or neck trauma. In basic chemistry, matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. Mass is also a physical property that determines an object's weight based on the Earth's gravitational pull. Elements are fundamental substances that are composed of matter. I suggest you look at the periodic table. You can actually find some pretty interesting facts about that. Here we have a chart describing the major elements, not totaling 100% of us, and the percentage of it in the body. Most living organisms need about 20 elements to survive. Atoms are these tiny particles that compose elements and the smallest complete units of an element, and they're basically what make us up. Atoms are composed of subatomic particles, protons, neutrons, and electrons. Protons are positively charged, neutrons are neutral, and electrons have a negative electrical charge. An atom's mass is determined by the number of protons and a neutron in the nucleus. Or actually, it's in the nucleus. I thought it was around. It's the electrons that are around. So here is the 4 electrons. And if we look up whatever, we can also see there's 4 protons and 4 neutrons, which means it's an even set. I'm not sure if that applies to the actual periodic table. But on the periodic table, if you look for the periodic element with the number 4, whatever that substance is, that's what the actual name would be. I'm not going to look it up right now. The atomic number, which is what it was. The number of protons in an atom, which is what is the main definition of it. Hydrogen is the simplest atom. I know it has 1 proton, and the atomic number is 1. Magnesium is 12 because it has 12 protons. The atomic weight equals the number of protons and neutrons in an element's nucleus. Oxygen has 8 protons and 8 neutrons. The atomic weight is 16. For isotopes, I love isotopes. An element whose atoms have nuclei containing the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. Those are isotopes. May or may not be radioactive. Radioactivity is the emission of energetic particles known as radiation, and this occurs due to the instability of atomic nuclei. One of the most reactive chemicals on the periodic table is fluorine. I forget what number that is, actually. I do believe it's like 14, but fluorine is the most reactive solely because the isotopes are so grand in scale that any reaction with any other substance, including air, oxygen, water, any kind of heat and kind of cooling, makes it combust. Radioactive decay is the process of emitting radiation. Emissions can destroy molecules, cells, and living tissue. Weaker radioactive isotopes are used to diagnose structural and functional characteristics of internal organisms, which is what X-rays do. We have alpha, beta, and gamma rays. Gamma rays are the most penetrating type and also similar to X-ray radiation. Any chemical structure that consists of atoms held together by covalent bonds. When two atoms of the same element bond, they produce molecules of that element. So we have hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and how atoms bond with other atoms results in interaction between electrons. So atoms may gain, lose, or share electrons. Inert atoms are chemically inactive. Ions are atoms that change the gain or lose electrons. Bonds that form between two ions are ionic bonds. Cation, basically we call them cations, but they're actually pronounced as cations. Cations are a positive charge. Anions have a negative charge. I like to remember this as cats are good, onions are bad, but controversial. An example is when sodium forms an ionic bond with chlorine to create sodium chloride, which is table salt. This is an ionic bond. We also have covalent bonds. Atoms complete their outer electron shells by sharing electrons. They do not gain or lose electrons because each atom achieves a stable form. So there's a happy number of electrons that they all try to reach. I believe it's 12, or it's 10 or 16. But in order to reach that happy number, they have to form, and they have an urge to form, which makes them so reactive, by the way, with other elements on the periodic table. And what happens with this is that they achieve a stable form once they combine, and when two hydrogen atoms bond to they form a hydrogen molecule. So as you can see here, they share, represented by the line in between. I love single and double covalence. I remember taking me back to chemistry class. Single covalent bonds is when a single pair of electrons is shared. Double covalent bonds when two pairs, and triples when three pairs of electrons are shared. Polar molecules is a covalent bond that has an uneven distribution of charges. So there's always a dipole movement when connecting in covalent bonds. You have an equal number of protons and electrons. On one end is slightly negative and the other slightly positive. Yep. So the dipole moment is represented by, I believe, what's called alpha, which is this little symbol right here. It looks like an incomplete 8. And the dipole movement is shown by those little alphas. And those alphas you would point towards the positive and give it a plus. Hydrogen bond. When the positive, a hydrogen end of a polar molecule is attracted to the negative nitrogen or oxygen end of another polar molecule, creates that dipole-dipole moment. Compounds are molecules made up of different bonds with atoms. Water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen. Molecular formulas are representations of the numbers and types of atoms in a molecule. And an example is H2O. 2 hydrogen atoms represented by the 2 and O is the actual thing shown on the periodic table, which is oxygen. Structural formulas are used to signify how atoms are joined and arranged inside molecules. Single bonds are represented by single lines, and doubles are represented by double lines. When represented in 3D models, different colors are used to show different types of atoms. Synthesis reactions. This occurs when 2 or more reactants, which are atoms, bond to form a more complex product or structure. This always involves the formulation of new chemical bonds. It requires energy, and it is important for growth and repair of tissues. A plus B equals AB. Decomposition is when the bonds break up. This basically happens, and it becomes, the formulation is AB equals A plus B. You split them in half, and it basically it's useful because it's used in the digestive tract when it breaks down things like proteins, glucose, and fat molecules into smaller fragments before absorbing those into the actual tissue. Exchange is when you swap 2 numbers. So AB plus CD equals AD plus CB. And the example of that is a reaction with an acid base, which forms water and salt. And that's when parts of the reacting molecule are just shuffled around. Reversible reactions are the product of a reaction that can change back into the reactants they originally were, usually called slinky reactions. They can proceed in opposite directions depending on the relative proportions of reactants and products, as well as how much energy is available. Many important biologic reactions are freely reversible. Enzymes are promoting chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy requirements. Activation energy is the energy that must be overcome in order for a chemical reaction to occur. Enzymes are catalysts, compounds that accelerate chemical reactions without themselves being permanently changed or consumed. Acids, bases, and the pH scale. If you've ever heard of the pH scale, it's something used to measure the quality of the water, actually. Electrolytes are substances that release ions in water. Acids are electrolytes that release hydrogen ions in water, and bases are electrolytes that release ions that bond with hydrogen ions. The pH value is used to measure hydrogen ion concentrations. This is expressed in a type of mathematical shorthand based on concentration calculated in moles per liter, with a mole representing the amount of solute in a solution. The pH of a solution is defined as the level of acidity or alkalinity. pH scale ranges from 0 to 14, with 7 being the midpoint. Pure water has a pH of 7. Measurements of lower than 7 are considered acidic, and measurements higher of 7 are considered basic or alkaline. The pH of blood usually ranges from 7.35 to 7.45. Abnormal fluctuations can damage cells and tissues, changing the shapes of proteins and later cellular functions. Acidosis is the blood pH lower than 7.35, and alkalosis is blood pH higher than 7.45. Buffers are chemicals that resist pH changes, combining with the excessive hydrogen ions or contributing with hydrogen ions when these ions are reduced. Here we have the scale. We can have an example of hydrochloric acid concentrated, which has a pH of 0. Your stomach acid is measured at a pH of 1, which, if you think about it, pretty damn strong. pH of 14 would be something like sodium hydroxide. Oven cleaner is at 13. Household ammonias are at like 11 to 12. Bleach is 9.5. And then we've got the in-betweens. As you can see on the bottom, we also have the shading scales, optimal for growth of fungi and optimal growth of bacteria. Always contain the elements carbon and hydrogen, and generally oxygen as well. Our organic chemicals may dissolve in water, but dissolve to greater effect in alcohol or either. Organic substances that dissolve in water usually do not release ions. Those are non-electrolytes. Inorganic chemicals do not contain the elements carbon and hydrogen. They release ions in water and are called electrolytes. Inorganic substances include oxygen, carbon dioxide, compounds known as salts, and water. The most abundant compound in the human body is water. Accounts for nearly 2/3 of the body weight. It's solute, which means any substance that dissolves in it. It is the most metabolic reaction. It actually creates the most metabolic reaction because anything can dissolve in there. The watery portion of blood carries vital substances among the digestive tract, respiratory tract, and the cells. This is, once again, oxygen, salts, sugars, and vitamins. Oxygen enters the body through the respiratory organs. It's transported in the blood, and then organelles inside the cells use the oxygen for energy, releasing the nutrients such as glucose to drive cellular metabolic activities. Carbon dioxide is an inorganic compound produced as a waste product when some metabolic processes release energy. This is exhaled via the lungs. Salts are the compounds of oppositely charged ions that are abundantly in tissues and fluids. It is important for transporting substances to and from cells, muscle contractions, and nerve impulse conduction. Carbohydrates provide much of the energy required by the body's cells. They help to build structures. The molecules consist of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Carbon atoms join in chains. Carbon atoms with shorter chains are called sugars. Simple sugars, which are monosaccharides, I didn't see the I, have 6 carbon atoms, 12 hydrogen atoms, and 6 oxygen atoms. Glucose, fructose, and galactose, ribose containing only 5 atoms of carbon, and deoxyribose containing only 5 atoms of carbon. Complex carbohydrates are disaccharides, double sugars. Polysaccharides may contain many simple joined sugar units, and glycogen is a polysaccharide synthesized by humans and other animals. Lipids do not dissolve in water. They may dissolve in other lipids, oils, or chloroform or alcohol. They may dissolve in other lipids, oils, either chloroform or alcohol. They include a variety of compounds with vital cell functions, fats, phospholipids, steroids, a single fat molecule, triglyceride. Oh my gosh. Why do they have to insert all these words? So unnecessary. A single fat molecule, triglyceride, consists of one glycerol molecule bonded to 3 fatty acid molecules. Triglycerides contain 3 different saturated and unsaturated fatty acid combinations, or just contain 2. Saturated and unsaturated fats. Phospholipids contain a glycerol portion with fatty acid chains, structurally related to glycolipids. This includes a phosphate group that is soluble in water and a fatty acid portion that is not, and an important part of the cell structure. A steroid is a large lipid molecule that share a distinctive carbon framework. They have 4 connected rings of carbon atoms with a basic structure of 3 6-carbon rings joined to 1 5-carbon ring. The examples: cholesterol, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, cortisol, and estradiol. Estradiol, I don't even know. Probably a medicine or something. Proteins are the most abundant organic component of the human body. It is vital for many bodily functions. gives you energy. It allows you to defend from with your antibodies, gives you hormonal requirements, and it's an enzymatic function. Some proteins combine with carbohydrates to become glycoproteins, and this allows cells to respond to certain molecules that bind to them. There are more than 200,000 types of proteins in the human body: antibodies, peptides, collagen, keratin, antibodies, and enzymes, cell membrane proteins. Nucleic acids are large organic molecules or macromolecules that carry genetic information or form structures within cells. Composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus, they store and process information at the molecular level. Deoxyribonucleic nucleic acid, or DNA, determines inherited characteristics, affects all aspects of the body structure and function, encodes the information needed to build proteins, controls the shape and physical characteristics of the body, and consists a pair of nucleotide chains that twist around each other in a double helix, much representing a spiral staircase. Ribonucleic acid, RNA, which is half of that, manufactures specific proteins by using the information provided by the DNA. This consists of a single chain of nucleotides. There are 3 types of them: messenger, transfer, and ribosomal, which is rRNA. Bunch of weird types. Oh my god, stop. What is wrong? Are we done here? I guess so. Well, I guess that's it. We went through all the boring 86 slides. Congratulations if you made it through. The only reason we went through the scientific aspect is because it is important to understand the very basics. You don't need to understand those big words, but especially for the science portion. But it is good to have a general understanding of how, just basically around how cells work, how atoms work. And if you don't have that kind of knowledge, hopefully you got it today.